Hi everyone, it's Sarah. I have for you today a movement practice for your hip flexors. So we're going to be doing a little bit of work or active compression in the hip flexors to strengthen them and awaken them. And then we'll do just a little bit of more restorative hip flexor practice. I feel that oftentimes we feel compelled to stretch our hip flexors into a deep lunge pose or even a splits pose, or maybe working a really deep passive pigeon stretch. And while that can be useful for some folks, for the majority of people, our hip flexors aren't necessarily tight or shortened necessarily. They might be shortened and very weak and unable to handle the load that we are demanding of them. So in this class, you will need 2 blocks. If you don't have 2 blocks, you could use something similar to this size, but they are going to be useful for you, and we're gonna use them as a little bit of assistance to bring the ground closer to us, but then we're also going to use them to increase the load in our hip flexors. So we will start with a little high kneeling flow to a lunge. And unfortunately, now I'm going to have to disturb my dog, who has gotten quite comfortable on my mat. So can you move, buddy? Can you go lay in your bed? Oh, he's not very happy about that. All right, so we're going to move our blocks up onto their highest side and come into this kneeling position. If your knees are bothered by this position, you could roll up your mat in the middle like this, just to create an extra cushion, or you could roll up a towel or a blanket and place that underneath your knees. So not directly underneath the kneecap per se, but right underneath your shins so that your knees don't even touch the ground. We'll bring our blocks onto their highest side. And then we'll just stretch the right leg back to start. You can curl your toes under. And maybe just a slight rocking forward and back. And as you extend your right hip back into extension, firm the right glutes and try to tuck your pelvis slightly under. It'll wind up being more neutral, but just feel the action of a slight posterior tuck of your pelvis. And then we're going to bend the knee, find our right hamstrings, and then draw this right thigh in towards our chest and try to creep the leg through without touching the ground with our heel or our toe. And see if you can land with your heel on the ground first. And then on an inhale, guide the chest forward slightly. And on an exhale, find a little cat back. Find neutral position. Use your right hamstrings to pull your right heel towards your seat and then step your right leg back. And the whole time you're doing this, you're trying to prevent your body from opening or tipping over to that right side. So see if you can maintain just a nice square presentation of your shoulders, your ribs, and even the whole pelvis. So with the right toes back, once again, we'll bend the knee, find your hamstrings, bring your heel as close to your seat as you can, and then start to pull your thigh into your chest. You're using your hip flexors to drive the right leg forward and creep it through so that your heel lands first. And you can bring your whole foot down on an inhale, draw your heart forward slightly, and on an exhale, find a little cat arch. And then you could do this particular little flow here 3 or 4 times, but for the sake of time for this video, I'm basically going to be showing you the exercises, maybe in reps of 2, and then you are free to pause the video and do more on your own. So we'll come to the second side, stretch our left toes back, keeping the pelvis square, so both hip points facing the ground. Same thing with the shoulders. Notice if you tend to open through the left hip here. Just going to do your best to try to stay as neutral as you can. And then as you extend your left leg back, try to keep a slight posterior tuck of your pelvis. So even though we're sensing that posterior tuck, you might wind up just being neutral, and that's kind of where we want ourselves to be. Now contract your left hamstrings to flex your left knee. And now start to feel your hip flexors. Draw your left thigh forward. Try to pull your leg through without touching the ground and land your heel bone first. On an inhale, lift your chest up slightly. And then on an exhale, just a mild cat arch in your back. And then lift the left leg up, bend your knee, use your hamstrings, sweep your left leg back, toes to the ground. One more time like that. Find the hamstrings, thigh to chest, and step forward. Inhale, draw your chest towards the front. Exhale, a little cat back. And then you would go back the way that you came. And now when that starts to feel pretty comfortable, there are a few different things you can do to increase the load. The first of which is to, once you get your leg forward, pause here for a bit and hover the right leg off of the ground. So now my foot is not touching, it's about an inch off the ground, and I'm using my hip flexors to maintain hip flexion in my right leg. And then you can relax off of that, give yourself a moment, take a breath. And you would repeat that on the second side if you were going to move on towards that. And if you wanted to involve a little balancing and also train some proprioception in your hips, which would help you with things like half moon pose, you could take away your blocks completely and do that same step forward without using your hands at all. And keep in mind when you do this that your body is going to have to probably be able to freely move a little bit to help you with your balance. You could do it either with just the sagittal plane movement, keeping the leg right in front of the hip like this, or you could add in some external rotation of the leg that's stepping forward. And one of the keys to this particular movement is to really anchor down through the back leg. So if my right leg is stepping forward, I'm going to anchor down through the top of my left foot and fire my left glutes to keep my pelvis in neutral. And so if I'm adding in that external rotation, you might have to just let your body tip to the left a little bit. The right leg comes out to the side into abduction. There's a little external rotation there, and then step forward. And you could add some little thoracic extension here if you wanted to add that in, or you could add some pelvic tilting if that's something that you're working on, freeing up some mobility in your pelvis. And then you could come back the way you came. You could either keep it straight in that sagittal plane, or use a wall, that's my trick. Or if you wanted to come back the way you came, taking the leg out to the side, you could add in both some abduction and some internal rotation of that right thigh to take it back to neutral. The first couple of times you do this one without your hands, it's going to feel almost impossible unless you've been doing it with me in class. It's not impossible. You can do it. It does take a little bit of time and a little bit of practice to get the hang of it. And you have to be willing to be off balance and try to find yourself, try to find your balance. That's really good work for your whole body and also your nervous system. All right, now we're going to move on to a stretch that I really like for the psoas. And it's not just a passive stretch. I do very little of that. This is a little bit more activating. And I think you're going to find it to be very powerful if you can kind of isolate all of the individual components that I'm going to offer to you. So let's go ahead and start with the left side, since we seem to always start with the right. We'll start with the left. So the left leg will come forward, and then the left leg, we're going to internally rotate it a little bit. So it doesn't have to be big. Internal rotation is really challenging for most of us, so just do the best that you can. And then the back leg is also going to internally rotate. So your toes, your right toes, are going to move outside the frame of your hip, and your knee is going to be angled slightly inward. Again, it doesn't have to be big. It can just be a few degrees. And then instead of sinking into your hips forward like this, like you might be tempted to do in a lunging position, move your hips back. And again, watch out for the knees. If this bothers your knees, you're going to find some little extra padding under the top of your shin, right underneath your kneecap. The back leg, which is your right leg right now, we're going to try to sense posterior tilt of the pelvis. That's when you're tucking your tailbone under. What that might result in is a more neutral pelvis for you. If you already feel like you're in a posterior tilt, then you don't have to activate that, but I do want you to feel your glutes. And then I'd also like you to press down a lot through the top of your right foot. So regardless of what the pelvis is doing, you're still activating your glute and you're still anchoring through the back foot. And then the arms are going to come forward like you're doing plank right out in front of you. The back leg is still really strong and anchored. The right glute is on line. And then with the arms in plank, we're going to externally rotate them until you can't externally rotate them anymore. So you might wind up with your palms facing the front and your fingertips down. And then we're going to flex the upper spine. So think of cat and cow. As you flex the upper spine, reach your arms forward and protract your shoulder blades mildly. And then bring your chin in towards your chest and reach the crown of your head towards your pinky fingers. If you can't feel anything in your right hip flexors, move your hips back slightly and tuck your pelvis under more and squeeze your right glute more. Press down through the top of your right foot more. Breathe for 3, 2, and one more breath. And then lift your head, neutralize your spine, rest your arms by your sides. And then you can take your hands down, step back. And I personally like a downward dog after that pose, and I like to stretch my right leg up and back. So whatever leg was in front, whatever leg was behind, take that hip for a spin. And that might be just here in a tabletop. You could do that. Let's try to find the rotation. And then you can take a little break. Now, how long you hold that particular half kneeling position for the psoas is completely up to you. You can build up to maybe 10 breaths. You can start with just 2 or 3. That's a very individualized choice that only you know the answer to. And then we would do the same thing on the second side. So finding both legs slightly internally rotated. So we're not just turning the foot in, we're trying to turn the whole thigh in. I guess I should switch legs. Right leg forward now. Left leg is back. And it's a little tricky thinking about rotation here. You might be tempted on that back leg to kick the toes over towards the right, but that's actually externally rotating your back leg. So instead, the knee is going to come in and the toes are going to go out. So it feels like your inner thigh is going back behind you rather than your inner thigh opening to the front. Find that slight internal rotation of the right. Posterior tuck of the pelvis, left glute on line, top of the left foot pressing down, arms in plank, externally rotate, so like you're dialing 2 radio buttons in opposite directions or screwing in 2 light bulbs. This one's tightening, the right one's tightening, the left one is loosening. Find a moderate cat back, so that's spinal flexion in thoracic. Chin can reach towards your chest, and the crown of head is reaching forward. And now if you don't feel anything right away, if you're feeling it mostly in your upper body, then move your hips back a little bit, tuck under more, and press down more through your back leg foot. And then squeeze your left glute. Might be kind of hard to balance in this, depending on the orientation of your pelvis. So just try to stick with it and do your best. Take another inhale and another exhale. And then let it go. So I would start with at least 2 sets of that. one on each side, especially if you're holding it for maybe 3 or 5 breaths. I think it might be more useful to do some shorter holds, but do more sets. So go back and forth between each leg. Take that left hip and take it into a rotation, either in your all fours position or maybe your downward dog position. And then we're going to come down onto our seat. And you'll need these blocks towards the front of your mat. This one, it might be useful or helpful anyway. If you struggle sitting upright with a neutral pelvis, then you could sit against your wall. And what I mean by that is if you sit in staff pose in Dandasana and your pelvis posteriorly tilts like this, and your front hip points lift up towards your rib cage, and your lower back pushes behind you, then it would be helpful to either sit on a block or a blanket, elevate your hips in some way so that you can get at least a neutral pelvis. And if it helps you to brace against the wall, you could also do that. But just be sure your back doesn't start to round, because that's going to be an important component of this next exercise. Sometimes what I'll do, if I'm feeling a little tight back here and I can't quite get that neutral pelvis, I'll take my hands behind me and just decrease the angle of my hip flexion. So more hip flexion might mean more pelvic tilt under or tuck under. Less hip flexion, if I widen out that angle, then I'm able to get my pelvis into neutral. And then we're just going to put one of these blocks on the lowest side beside your right leg. And then flex your feet so your ankles are in dorsiflexion. And with control, lift, sweep, and lower. Lift, sweep, and lower. So this is a very controlled movement. It is not a swing. It's not a swing and a drop. It should be completely silent. Lift, sweep, and lower. I would say do as many as you can. Okay, so maybe start with 5, work up to 10, maybe work up to 30 as you get stronger. And as you're able to find this more neutral position in your spine, when those get too easy, then you move the block up to the second height. If you find yourself rocking back to lift up, then come back to this starting position. So you would do however many you can handle on the low side, however many you can handle on the high side. That might be 1 or 2 to start. There's no need to overdo it. If you're just starting this practice and you get a big muscle cramp, muscle cramps aren't necessarily bad things. Basically what that is information. And the muscle maybe has been slightly overloaded, but it's not an injury. It's basically saying, oh, hey, I'm awake now. If your hip flexors aren't maybe pulling their load, you might get a little cramp in your quadriceps. So do as many as you can. And then for a little bit of relief, we'll go the other direction with the hip. We'll come into hip extension. So hands will come behind you. Fingers can be turned in any direction, whatever feels most comfortable for your shoulders. Bend your knees. And then we'll come into a little hip drive towards the sky. And so don't worry too much about what's happening in the upper body. In other words, you don't have to make this a big back bend near your chest, but focus more on elevating the hips. And as you're elevating your hips, drive your heels down and try to pull them towards your fingers without moving them. So find an isometric hamstring action here. And then you can slowly lower down. And then if you wanted to pause this video and do the second side with control, a lift, a sweep, and a lower. And we're calling these block hurdles or block hurdlers. If you can come up with a better word, a better name for that, I'd love to hear that. After you do your second side, you'd come back into that reverse tabletop. And just take, 5 breaths or so, whatever feels good. And if this particular arrangement bothers your wrists, I wanted to actually address that in this video as well, since we're using wrist extension. And I wanted to talk a little bit about passive range of motion versus active range of motion and what that can mean for our joints. So when you take yourself into a plank position, you are using the ground basically as leverage to create a greater degree of wrist extension. And I'll show you what I mean by that. When I come to plank, or let's just say tabletop even for our purposes here, I've got about 90 degrees of extension in my wrists. I've got lots of little wrinkles here in my wrists in front. And that feels okay. It doesn't bother me. I can go beyond that because I'm using the ground as leverage. I can go beyond that and even decrease the angle between my hand and my upper arm bone or my lower arm bone. So it might be more like, I don't know, 70 degrees. But then I want to compare where I'm at without using the ground as leverage. So coming into a straight arm position and extending my wrist like I'm doing plank without the leverage of the wall or the floor. And just compare what that angle is. This is my active range of motion, using the muscles that actually extend my wrist. Compare that with what I'm capable of in a passive range of motion. The idea is that when you have a big variance between your passive range and your active range, there's a potential there for maybe instabilities or weaknesses or blind spots, because you are no longer in control of that range of motion. You're asking the ground, you're relying on the ground to produce the force that you need to get into that extended position. And that's not to say that that's all bad, but I think the closer that we can come between our active range of motion and our passive, the more integrated and stable, safe, and in control we're going to be of all of these movements, whether it's hip extension or hip flexion, shoulder flexion, shoulder extension, all of those things. Just start to pay attention to that. How far can you get into these things by using the muscles that are designed to make that motion when you compare it to having the assistance of someone either guiding you into it deeper or using a wall or using the floor? And I'll give you one example just with the shoulder extension. If I'm just keeping my arms free and I'm just trying to lift my arms as high as I can without borrowing any kind of leverage from anything else, including my spine, if I'm keeping my spine straight instead of flexing it to get my arms higher, compare that with taking my hands and binding them together and then lifting my arms. So this would be more of a passive range of motion exploration. Can I maintain that same level of extension without using my arms? Sometimes I can. It just depends on the movement. Something to think about in your own practice. All right, the next exercise is probably one of the more challenging ones. And I'll be honest, this particular block is not ideal for this. So if you have a small squishy ball, or you could even roll up a soft towel. Sometimes I'll use one of the gym towels and we'll put that into position instead of this block, but I'm just going to use the block today because I have it handy. So your left leg is just going to come into like a half butterfly pose. Once again, we're going to try to achieve a neutral pelvis. So if you feel yourself tipping back in the pelvis, then you're going to do this with your hands behind you so that your pelvis can be in neutral. The block is going to be wedged between your trunk and your right thigh. And then all we're going to do here is straighten the leg and bend it. Try to keep it up off the ground. Hold the block. You're maintaining pretty strong active hip flexion. And then we're trying to actively stretch that right hamstring without using any external load. And then we're also contracting it to make our knee flex. This is probably everybody's favorite love to hate. And then I really like the reverse tabletop as a counter to that. And you could add in something different to that if you wanted to play around with something like this, a figure 4, or maybe just wagging the leg side to side. So you would repeat that on the second side, do as many as you can, and remember that your form is the priority over the number of reps that you do. So quality reps, lower repetitions with quality form are better than more repetitions with not so great form. And you have to keep yourself accountable, because if there's nobody there to watch and see, maybe you can record yourself and play it back and see how it looks. All right, next thing. Come down onto our backs and have this block handy. Bend your knees, get your pelvis in neutral, and then drive your hips up into extension like a bridge, and then slide that block underneath your pelvis. Make sure that it's not in your low back, in your lumbar curve. Keep it pretty low in the flat part of your sacrum. Right leg will extend out, toe actively pointing, not like ballet toes, but more like gas pedal. So you can spread your toes out, but point through the ball of your foot. So it looks a little bit like a Barbie foot. And then your left leg can just stay here for a moment and just keep this leg in neutral. Right hip is an active extension, and you're reaching your whole right thigh towards the front of your mat. And then you can even give your right glute a squeeze here. And imagine that you're trying to just slightly tuck your pelvis under. It probably won't actually move. It'll be more neutral. But our tendency here is to let the pelvis tilt forward. And then we're potentially causing some compression in the low back. We want to keep the low back long. So if we can try to feel a little posterior tuck under of the pelvis, turn the right glute on to assist with this hip extension, and then stretch our toes away from us, we might feel a nice active stretch in your hip flexor in front. And hold that for as long as you like, and then you'd switch legs, same thing. Just time yourself with your breaths. 5 to 10 breaths, maybe you do 2 reps on each side, maybe you just do a longer hold on both sides. And then potentially, if it feels okay in your body, you could try to keep the sense of a posterior tuck, and maybe both legs go out. That could be a lot on your lower back, so only you know if this is going to be appropriate for you. Hold that for as many breaths as you like, and then bend your knees, lift your hips off of the ground, and slide the block away from you. Now this next one is my favorite, because we aren't just offering some change here in the hip flexors, but we're also getting into some internal rotation of the thighs, which is pretty rare, and not just in our lives, but also in a yoga practice. We don't do a lot of internal rotation, but our hips were meant to do that. So we should teach them how to do that, how to remember how to do that. They used to know, they just maybe forgot. So bring your feet out as wide as your mat, or maybe even wider. Let your legs windshield wiper to the right. So if your feet are too close together in this, you're not going to get the benefit. So the feet have to be wide like this, maybe even wider than your mat. As you bring your legs to the right, you're going to come onto the outer edge of your right foot and the inner edge of your left foot. And the inner left knee and thigh will be turning towards the ground. Now, they don't have to touch the ground. That's not necessarily our goal here. But what we want to feel is the left thigh stretching at a diagonal towards the front right corner of our mat. So mostly stretching forward, but you can also work on dropping the knee closer to the ground. But we're only coming to, let's say, the first edge of our stretch for now, the first edge of sensation. And then you can start to fan that left leg up and down, adding a little more increased load. Fan it up and down. And if you had a partner, you could actually ask them, when you press your leg up, ask them to resist and try to push your leg down. And when you bring your leg down, ask them to bring their hand underneath your knee and try to pull it up. And you're going to press down against them. Not overly forceful, just a little resistance, just a little increase in the load. Do 3 of those and then just take a rest and stay in the same position and come back to your breath. Feel a 360-degree expansion in all directions, front and back in size, equal pressure when you inhale. And then come back to the center. Make yourself neutral for a moment. Stretch your legs out, little mini shavasana. And then other side. Legs come pretty wide. Wiper to the left. And then the same thing. Progressively trying to get your thigh, your right thigh, away from your pelvis, reach it forward, and then also trying to stretch your knee closer to the ground. And then fan it up and lower it down. Just a couple times, with or without assistance from a partner. And then you're going to just settle in and relax for a little bit. I actually have my blocks under my left leg. I would normally do that. I didn't show that on the first side, but this isn't about getting really twisty in your back. We want to try to keep the low back in neutral. In other words, we don't want to have a big spinal twist and raise the hips up off the ground. All we're after is this internal rotation of the thigh and a little stretch away from the pelvis with the right femur. So it's not a spinal twist per se. Although I do love a good spinal twist. All right, so after you've done that, you could take your Shavasana now, or there's one more hip flexor practice that you could work on, and this one takes a little time, and it might be something that you could work on individually, aside from all of these other elements. If you're short on time, you don't have to do this one. And I'm not going to actually do the whole thing with you because it could take 15 minutes or even more to kind of reach what I'm after here. So you'd start with your feet together, big toes touching, heels touching, feet flat on the ground, and that's where you're going to keep your feet. So if you are tempted to open the thighs so much that your feet lift off like Baddha Konasana, try to keep your feet grounded. Okay, so all we're after here is eventually external rotation, or actually it's abduction. We're just taking the legs out to the side like butterfly pose, but the feet are going to stay down. So find a little posterior tuck. Peel your hips off of the ground like you're coming into bridge. And then open your legs as wide as you can. And you're going to continue to work the glutes here. You're going to feel your hamstrings working. Knees are moving diagonally away from your hips, but the feet are staying down. Soles of the feet, all parts of your feet are touching the ground. And keep actively moving the thighs away from your midline. And then about 1 degree at a time, you're going to come in and hold. And you would eventually work your way really slowly all the way back in. Hips stay up in bridge. Still a little posterior tuck of the pelvis to keep your low back long. And then once again, you come all the way out. And this is going to be a lot slower. I'm doing this in super hyper speed. You would eventually move as slow as you possibly could. And you're going to be fatiguing your glutes. You're going to be fatiguing your hamstrings. And maybe, some of the quads as well. You're going to feel that in all of your big muscular groups. All the way out until your body maybe starts to shake a little bit. You might start to feel some tremors happening. Your hips might bounce up and down a little bit. That's when you know that you're doing it right. So this could take a while, all right? And if you feel like you need to do that a few more times, you're going to slowly work in and out, and then just keep the legs out. You only have to do one. Keep the legs out as long as you can. until the glutes feel like they want to give up, the hamstrings want to give up, and then see if you can stick with it until you get to the shake. You can get to the shake and you can stay in that shaking sensation for as long as you can sustain it. And then slowly articulate your spine down. Top of the spine lands first. Scoop the tailbone under. Articulate your spine down one vertebra at a time. And then you would find your Shavasana, passive rest. Minimum of 5 minutes. Highly encouraged. This right here is the most important part of any yoga practice, in my opinion. This is where it all comes together. This is what your nervous system needs, the down regulation, right? Because we just did a lot. We did a lot of active strengthening and really good work. But it's nice and necessary to rest afterwards. So stay as long as you like. Feel free to ask me some questions about this if you have any remarks at all. I'm always happy to take your feedback, and we'll see you next time.